Carl Jung discovered something that changed how we understand suffering. Deep suffering, when consciously integrated, does not break people. It forges them into something extraordinary. Jung documented patients who endured years of pain, betrayal, and trauma. These individuals did not simply survive. They transformed their breaking point into a breakthrough that made them psychologically untouchable. Today I'll show you the 13 traits that emerge when someone has truly suffered and integrated that suffering at the deepest level. Jung called suffering the furnace that either destroys you or forges you into something remarkable. The difference between these two outcomes is not the amount of suffering, but how consciously you integrate it. He realized that people who suffer deeply and survive develop abilities that others cannot understand. They see patterns others miss. They trust their perceptions absolutely. They become immune to manipulation while maintaining their capacity for genuine connection. This is not about becoming cold or closed off. This is about becoming whole. The traits I'm about to share are not signs of damage. They are signs of transformation. Jung spent decades observing how deep suffering, when consciously processed, creates psychological strengths that most people never develop. These are not traits you develop through reading books or taking courses. These are traits forged in the fire of real pain, real betrayal, and real darkness. If you recognize these traits in yourself, understand that your suffering was not meaningless. It was the catalyst for your transformation. People who have suffered deeply and integrated that suffering develop what Jung called differentiated intuition. They can read micro-expressions instantly. They sense hidden emotions before they are expressed. They perceive psychological patterns that escape everyone else. This ability did not come from natural talent. It came from years of having to read people accurately for survival. When you grow up in chaos, you learn to detect the smallest shifts in mood, the slightest changes in energy, the barely perceptible signs that danger is coming. This hypervigilance becomes refined into something far more sophisticated. It becomes a strategic tool for navigating relationships with surgical precision. These individuals do not just feel what is happening in a room. They know what is happening 3 moves ahead. Jung observed that this capacity develops through what he called necessity training. When your psychological or physical survival depends on reading people accurately, your brain rewires itself to process social information at extraordinary speeds. What takes most people conscious effort becomes automatic for them. They walk into a room and immediately understand the power dynamics, the hidden tensions, the unspoken conflicts. This is not paranoia. This is pattern recognition refined through years of data collection in high-stakes environments. The second trait is absolute immunity to gaslighting. Someone who has suffered deeply and integrated that suffering trusts their internal perception completely. They have learned to distinguish between absorbed content and authentic self. When someone tries to tell them their feelings are wrong, their perceptions are mistaken, or their memories are false, they simply smile and walk away. They spent years being told they were too sensitive, too emotional, or imagining things. Then they discovered they were right all along. That discovery creates an unshakable foundation of self-trust. They no longer need external validation because they have validated themselves through experience. Gaslighters cannot operate on people who trust their own perceptions more than anyone else's words. Jung documented how his patients who reached this stage experienced what he called liberation from external authority. They stopped asking others if their feelings were valid. They stopped questioning their own memories when someone contradicted them. They stopped apologizing for seeing what they saw. This shift represents a fundamental change in the location of psychological authority. It moves from external sources to internal knowing. Once this shift happens, manipulation tactics that work on most people simply bounce off. The third trait is understanding sensitivity as a war room. People who have suffered deeply realize that their past emotional absorption was not weakness. It was data collection. Every painful interaction, every moment of absorbing someone else's dysfunction, every time they felt too much, became part of an enormous database of psychological information. Jung observed that his most perceptive patients had catalogued human behavior with startling accuracy. They remembered patterns, triggers, manipulations, and defense mechanisms from everyone they encountered. This was not conscious study. It was survival, creating a strategic advantage. Now they use that database to navigate relationships with precision. Their sensitivity is not a burden. It is their greatest tactical asset. What appeared to be a curse was actually preparation. All those years of feeling everything, noticing everything, and being overwhelmed by everything created a level of emotional intelligence that cannot be taught. They can predict how someone will react before they speak. They can identify manipulation tactics in real time. They can sense when someone is lying, even when the lie is technically plausible. This operational awareness transforms sensitivity from a vulnerability into a weapon of psychological self-defense. The fourth trait is genuine psychological mindedness. This is different from intellectual interest in psychology. This is a non-defensive curiosity about inner reality, patterns, and growth. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. People who have genuinely suffered and integrated that suffering are fascinated by what drives behavior, including their own. They do not run from uncomfortable truths about themselves. They seek them out. Jung called this the mark of someone who has done deep inner work. They understand that healing requires looking at everything, not just the comfortable parts. This trait separates people who have truly transformed from people who are still performing transformation. When you point out a blind spot to someone with genuine psychological mindedness, they lean in with interest rather than pulling back in defense. They ask questions. They explore the possibility. They examine their own behavior without shame or denial. This openness to uncomfortable self-knowledge creates continuous growth. They are not trying to prove they are healed. They are committed to actually healing, which means remaining open to discovering parts of themselves that still need attention. The fifth trait is shadow acknowledgement without judgment. Jung discovered that people who see others' shadows clearly often do so because they have integrated their own. When you acknowledge that you contain every human quality you observe in others, something remarkable happens. You gain clarity without judgment. These individuals understand they are capable of deception, selfishness, and cruelty, not because they act on these impulses, but because they are human. This acknowledgement creates freedom. They can observe manipulation without being triggered by it. They can witness dysfunction without needing to fix it or condemn it. They simply see it clearly and make informed decisions about where they invest their energy. Jung wrote extensively about how shadow integration eliminates the need for projection. When you own your capacity for darkness, you stop being shocked or outraged by darkness in others. You recognize it as part of the human condition. This does not mean you tolerate abuse or enable dysfunction. It means you respond to it from a place of clarity rather than reactive emotion. You see someone manipulating and you think, I understand that impulse because I have felt it too, but I choose not to act on it. And I choose not to participate with someone who does. This creates decisive action without emotional charge. The sixth trait is conscious boundaries, combined with selective empathy. People who have suffered deeply learn to be deeply caring, but strategically protective of where that care flows. Jung called this love with boundaries. They do not love less. They love more wisely. They understand that giving everyone unlimited access to your empathy depletes you and enables dysfunction. So they become selective. They care deeply for people who reciprocate and respect them. They maintain polite distance from people who drain or manipulate. This is not coldness. This is psychological survival combined with genuine wisdom about how to sustain caring relationships long term. Jung observed that his patients who developed this capacity stopped experiencing the exhaustion that previously characterized their relationships. They learned to distinguish between compassion, which can be extended to all beings, and investment, which should be reserved for relationships that are reciprocal and healthy. They stopped trying to save people who did not want to be saved. They stopped pouring energy into relationships that only flowed one direction. This created space for relationships that actually nourished them instead of depleting them. The seventh trait is absence of collective possession. Jung documented how sensitive individuals often lose their identity by absorbing collective unconscious contents. People who have suffered deeply and integrated that suffering develop the ability to hold other people's psychological contents temporarily without losing their individual identity. They can feel what others feel, understand what others experience, but maintain clear awareness that these are not their own contents. Jung called this the ability to be a psychological container. They can help others process difficult emotions without being overwhelmed or losing themselves in the process. This is an extraordinarily rare capacity that only develops through years of learning to distinguish self from other. Most empathic people struggle because they absorb others' emotions and then cannot tell where they end and others begin. People who have integrated deep suffering learn to create what Jung called permeable but intact boundaries. Energy can flow through them, but it does not stick to them. They can be present with someone's pain without taking that pain home. They can witness someone's anger without becoming angry themselves. This creates the capacity to be genuinely helpful to others without sacrificing their own well-being in the process. The eighth trait is the end of the persona. People who have integrated deep suffering no longer seek uncanny social perfection. They have learned that authenticity is safer than a flawless mask. Jung observed that patients who maintain perfect personas often experience devastating shadow eruptions. People who have truly suffered learn that showing up authentically with all their imperfections creates more genuine connection than performing perfection. They stop trying to be what others want them to be. They simply become who they actually are. This does not make them rude or inappropriate. It makes them real in a world full of performance. The relief that comes from dropping the mask cannot be overstated. All the energy that was being spent on maintaining an image becomes available for actual living. All the anxiety about being discovered as imperfect disappears when you stop pretending to be perfect. Jung documented how this shift creates what he called psychological efficiency. When you are not managing multiple versions of yourself for different audiences, your energy is no longer fragmented. You become coherent, consistent, and far more powerful because all your psychological resources are working in the same direction instead of maintaining elaborate facades. The ninth trait is understanding the scapegoat phenomenon. People who have suffered deeply often realize that being rejected or blamed was not about their personal failure. It was about reflecting the collective shadow. Jung documented how highly perceptive individuals become designated problems in groups, not because they cause problems, but because they reveal problems that already exist. Once you understand this pattern, being scapegoated loses its emotional charge. You recognize it as a psychological defense mechanism in others, not a statement about your worth. This understanding creates remarkable resilience against group dynamics that would destroy someone who does not understand what is happening. When a family, workplace, or social group needs someone to blame for dysfunction, they unconsciously select the person who sees most clearly. This person becomes the repository for everything the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. Understanding this dynamic protects you from internalizing the blame. You see the mechanism operating and refuse to accept the role being projected onto you. This awareness allows you to exit toxic systems without the psychological damage that comes from believing you actually are the problem. The 10th trait is capacity for solitude, combined with need for it. People who have integrated deep suffering require regular solitude for what Jung called conscious discrimination. This is not antisocial behavior. This is psychological necessity. They need time alone to distinguish their own psychological contents from absorbed material, to process experiences without external influence, to recharge their capacity for genuine presence with others. They understand that solitude is not loneliness. It is essential maintenance for people with highly differentiated perception. Without it, they become overwhelmed and lose clarity. Jung wrote about how his most perceptive patients scheduled solitude as rigorously as others schedule social commitments. They recognized that their capacity to be present with others depended on having adequate time alone to discharge absorbed content and reconnect with their authentic self. This is not optional for people with this level of sensitivity. It is required. They learned that saying yes to too many social demands meant saying no to their own well-being. So they became protective of their solitude, understanding it as the foundation that allowed all their other capacities to function properly. The 11th trait is absence of inflation. Jung documented how people with superior perception often fall into the profit complex, believing they must save everyone from unconsciousness. People who have truly integrated their suffering avoid this trap. They use their gifts for service without sacrifice. They help when asked and appropriate, but they do not identify with being the helper. They understand their insights are valuable, but not evidence of superiority. This humility creates sustainability. They can maintain their gifts long-term because they are not exhausting themselves trying to rescue everyone. Jung observed that inflation happens when someone identifies their ego with archetypal contents. They start believing they are special, chosen, or elevated above others. This creates psychological instability and eventual collapse. People who have integrated deep suffering recognize their gifts as capacities, not as proof of superiority. They see clearly, but do not believe this makes them better than those who do not see clearly. They simply have different capabilities developed through different circumstances. This prevents the spiritual pride that destroys so many people with genuine gifts. The 12th trait is visionary status, combined with acceptance of being ahead of collective readiness. Jung believed highly perceptive individuals serve as consciousness pioneers. They sense psychological and social issues before collective readiness to address them. People who have suffered deeply and integrated that suffering understand they are laboratories for consciousness experiments. They see what is coming before others can see it, but they no longer need others to validate what they see. They hold their vision with patience, knowing that collective consciousness will eventually catch up. This creates remarkable peace with being misunderstood. They stop trying to convince people who are not ready to understand. They stop feeling frustrated when others cannot see what seems obvious to them. They recognize they are perceiving from a different level of psychological development, and that is okay. They share their insights when others are receptive, and stay quiet when others are not ready. This discrimination prevents the exhaustion that comes from constantly fighting to be understood by people who lack the framework to understand. The 13th trait is psychological invincibility. This is the culmination of all previous traits. Jung documented patients who reached a state where they were psychologically untouchable. They had transformed their breaking point into a breakthrough. They could no longer be manipulated because they saw manipulation coming. They could no longer be gaslit because they trusted their perceptions absolutely. They could no longer be broken because they had already been to the bottom and emerged stronger. This is not hardness. This is integration. They maintained capacity for gentleness with those who earned it, and implacable strength against those who would exploit it. Jung called this the ultimate result of conscious suffering integration. These individuals become what he described as psychologically sovereign. They answer to their own internal authority. They cannot be controlled through fear, guilt, or shame because they have already confronted the worst versions of themselves and integrated those aspects. They cannot be threatened with loss because they have already lost everything and rebuilt. They cannot be destabilized by chaos because they learn to function in chaos. This state is not something you achieve and maintain passively. It requires constant conscious attention and continued integration work. But once you reach it, you have a foundation that cannot be shaken by external circumstances. The path to developing these traits is not pleasant. It requires being broken by life in ways that force you to confront your shadow, integrate your pain, and rebuild yourself from the ground up. Jung documented that this transformation often begins with what he called the clarity event. This is the moment when betrayal, loss, or suffering becomes so intense that denial is no longer possible. Everything you thought you knew about yourself, others, and the world gets shattered. This is the crucible. In that moment, you have a choice. You can remain a victim of what happened to you, or you can become sovereign over your own psychological reality. People who developed these 13 traits chose sovereignty. They chose to look directly at their pain instead of numbing it. They chose to examine their role in their suffering instead of only blaming others. They chose to integrate their shadow instead of projecting it. They chose to rebuild themselves according to their own values instead of continuing to perform for others. These choices are not made once. They are made repeatedly, in small moments, and large crises over years of conscious inner work. The choice to integrate suffering consciously rather than remain unconsciously broken determines whether your pain destroys you or transforms you. Jung observed that most people, when pushed to their absolute limit, choose transformation. They do not become cruel, they become precise. They do not lose their hearts, they gain backbones. They do not close off from connection. They become selective about where they invest their emotional energy. This is the difference between being broken and being forged. Broken people remain fragmented, reactive, and controlled by their past. Forged people become integrated, responsive, and empowered by their history. The difference is visible in how they move through the world. Broken people carry their pain like an open wound, bleeding on everyone around them, while insisting they are not hurt. Forged people carry their scars like armor, visible reminders of what they survived that no longer have power over them. They do not hide their history. They integrate it as part of their strength. Understanding these traits creates freedom. If you recognize them in yourself, you are not damaged, you are developed. Your sensitivity is not weakness, it is sophisticated pattern recognition. Your boundaries are not coldness, they are wisdom about sustainable caring. Your solitude is not isolation, it is necessary psychological maintenance. Your ability to see clearly is not judgment, it is differentiated perception combined with integrated shadow. Jung spent his life documenting how the people who suffer most deeply often become the most psychologically powerful. Not despite their suffering, but because of how they integrated it. He observed that suffering itself is neutral. It is neither good nor bad. It simply is. What matters is how you respond to it. Do you let it fragment you into pieces that never properly heal, or do you use it as the hammer and anvil to forge yourself into something stronger than you were before? That choice, made consciously and repeatedly, determines whether you develop these 13 traits or remain trapped in unconscious victimhood. The world needs people who have developed these traits. Society functions partly through collective unconscious agreements about what will not be acknowledged. People with integrated suffering threaten these agreements simply by existing authentically. They see through shared illusions. They refuse to participate in collective denial. They speak uncomfortable truths when necessary. This makes them destabilizing forces in unconscious systems, but it also makes them essential for psychological evolution. Jung believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception become what he called culture carriers. They prepare humanity for psychological development that is inevitable but not yet obvious. Throughout history, the people who pushed human consciousness forward were often people who had suffered deeply and transformed that suffering into wisdom. They were not comfortable people. They were not easy people, but they were necessary people. They served as lightning rods for collective transformation, absorbing the shock of new awareness so that others could gradually adjust to new levels of consciousness. Your suffering was not meaningless. It was the price of admission to psychological capabilities that most people never develop. Jung discovered that deep suffering, when consciously integrated, produces traits that are simultaneously gentle and implacable. You can care deeply without being destroyed by caring. You can see clearly without being consumed by what you see. You can love fully without losing yourself in love. This is the gift hidden inside the curse of suffering. It transforms victims into sovereign beings who cannot be manipulated, gaslit, or broken because they have already survived the worst and emerged whole. Every person who completes this transformation serves as proof that it is possible. They become walking evidence that suffering does not have to destroy you. They show others that there is a path through the darkness that leads not back to where you started, but forward to something you could never have become without going through the fire. The 13 traits are not destinations. They are ongoing practices. You do not achieve psychological invincibility and stop working. You maintain it through continued conscious discrimination, regular solitude, ongoing shadow integration, and strategic choices about where you invest your energy. Jung emphasized that integration is not a permanent achievement, but a dynamic process requiring constant conscious attention. The moment you stop paying attention, old patterns can return. The moment you stop maintaining boundaries, dysfunction can creep back in. The moment you stop trusting your perceptions, manipulation can take hold again. These traits require maintenance, but the maintenance becomes easier over time. The neural pathways strengthen. The discriminations become more automatic. The boundaries become more natural. You are not starting from zero each day. You are building on an ever stronger foundation. Each conscious choice reinforces the structure. Each successful navigation of difficulty adds to your confidence. Each time you trust your perception and discover you were right, the trust deepens. This is how psychological invincibility is built and maintained, through thousands of small choices to stay conscious instead of slipping back into unconsciousness. If you have suffered deeply and recognize these traits emerging in yourself, understand that you are not alone. Jung documented this pattern across cultures and time periods. Throughout history, individuals who experienced profound suffering and integrated it consciously became healers, teachers, leaders, and guides for others. Not because they were special before their suffering, but because suffering forged them into something extraordinary when they chose conscious integration over unconscious fragmentation. Your pain was the furnace. Your choice to integrate it consciously was the hammer. These 13 traits are what emerged when the metal was finally cooled and tempered. You are part of a lineage of people who transformed their worst experiences into their greatest strengths. You carry forward a tradition of psychological alchemy that turns lead into gold, wounds into wisdom, and victims into victors, not over others, but over the unconscious patterns that would otherwise control them. Jung's most important discovery about suffering was not that it breaks people. It was that conscious integration of suffering creates psychological capabilities that cannot be developed any other way. You cannot learn differentiated intuition from a book. You cannot develop immunity to gaslighting through a course. You cannot understand your shadow without confronting your darkness. You cannot become psychologically invincible without surviving the worst life can throw at you. These traits are earned through experience, integrated through conscious work, and maintained through ongoing attention. They are the hidden gift inside the terrible curse of deep suffering. Jung spent decades showing people that the choice was always available, regardless of what happened to them. He could not prevent their suffering. No one can. But he could show them how to use that suffering as raw material for transformation instead of letting it destroy them. That was his gift to psychology and to anyone who has ever suffered deeply and wondered if there was any meaning in the pain. The question is not whether you will suffer. Life guarantees suffering for everyone. The question is whether you will suffer consciously or unconsciously, whether you will integrate your pain or be fragmented by it, whether you will emerge from the furnace forged or destroyed. Jung spent his life showing people how to choose conscious integration. These 13 traits are the evidence that someone made that choice and did the work required to transform their breaking point into a breakthrough. If you recognize these traits in yourself, you have already made that choice. You are not broken. You are becoming whole. And that process of becoming is never truly finished. It continues as long as you continue to choose consciousness over unconsciousness, integration over fragmentation, sovereignty over victimhood. Every day presents new opportunities to either reinforce these traits or let them atrophy. The choice is always yours. If you recognize yourself in these 13 traits, you are part of a rare group that Jung believed essential for human psychological evolution. Share in the comments which trait resonates most deeply with you. Your journey of integrating suffering connects with others walking the same path. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about psychological development that transforms pain into power. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.